The streets of Chicago pulsed with noise. Streetcars clattered, factories roared, and thousands crowded into a massive hall lit by flickering gas lamps. They weren't there for politics or theater. They'd come to hear a plain-spoken man with a gravelly voice, Dwight L. Moody. Across the Atlantic, the same scenes unfolded in London. Lines of people stretched for blocks. Newspapers reported choirs thundering hymns under the direction of Ira Sankey. Hearts softened, lives changed, and churches stirred awake. It was 1885, and a revival was sweeping both sides of the ocean. No fireworks, no theatrics, just clear preaching, heartfelt singing, and an invitation to follow Jesus. Crowds of ordinary people responded, but the real question wasn't how many filled the seats, it was how many would leave those halls transformed and carry the fire of evangelism into the weary world. From the That's Jesus channel, welcome to Coach, where we trace church origins and church history. I'm Bob Balch. On Fridays, we stay between 1500 and 2000 AD. Today, we turn to the year 1885, when revival fires in Chicago and London would ripple outward across the entire globe. Dwight L. Moody. He was not a trained scholar or a polished orator. He was a shoe salesman turned evangelist who believed that ordinary people needed the gospel explained in ordinary words. In 1885, his campaigns shook two of the world's greatest cities. With simple sermons and Ira Sankey's powerful hymns, Moody drew thousands to hear the message of Christ. But Moody didn't stop at events. Through his Northfield Conferences and training of lay workers, he set in motion a movement that reached beyond auditoriums into neighborhoods, missions, and churches worldwide. It was more than a sermon of meetings. It was the spark of modern evangelical outreach. By the 1880s, Dwight L. Moody was already a household name in Protestant circles. Born in rural Massachusetts, he had little formal education. He worked as a shoe salesman before conversion changed his life, and from there he poured his energy into teaching Sunday school, working with the YMCA, and eventually preaching across America and Europe. The Christian Advocate reported that Moody's 1885 meetings in Chicago drew thousands with plain preaching and Sankey's hymns. In Chicago, the city where Moody had built his ministry, revival meetings were drawing record crowds. Workers, businessmen, mothers, children, they packed into the halls. And the preaching was direct: sin, grace, and the need for a personal faith in Christ. At Moody's side stood Ira Sankey, whose hymns carried the message to hearts in a way words alone could not. That same year, across the Atlantic, Moody returned to London, where he had preached earlier with remarkable results. Converts weren't simply counted, many joined churches, volunteered for missions, and began spreading the faith themselves. Moody's method was simple: preach plainly, sing powerfully, and invite earnestly. In an age of complex theology and sharp denominational divides, his straightforward approach seemed like fresh air. And in 1885, it captured attention on both sides of the ocean. The energy of 1885 was not just in the crowds, but in what came after. Moody was convinced that revival had to extend beyond single words. Quote, "The gospel is free to all who will take it." And that conviction gave birth to the Northfield Conferences in his hometown of Northfield. There, pastors, missionaries, and ordinary lay workers gathered for days of preaching, prayer, and training. Local newspapers described the meeting as schools of fire, equipping believers to go back into their communities with renewed zeal. In Chicago, Moody's Institute, later the Moody Bible Institute, was founded on the same principle: evangelism must be multiplied. Instead of relying on one preacher, he envisioned an army of men and women carrying the gospel to cities, towns, and villages. Meanwhile, in London, the revival crossed denominational lines altogether. Anglicans, Baptists, Methodists, and others found themselves worshiping side by side. Moody's simple preaching stripped away theological jargon. Sankey led songs like The 90 and 9 that drove home the urgency of Christ's call. Reports in the Christian Advocate and YMCA records tell of young people dedicating themselves to foreign missions and to social reform. Revival was not just saving souls anymore, it was reshaping society. Urban poverty, education, and evangelism began to overlap in ways that marked a new chapter for Protestant churches. By mid-1885, the revival movement had reached a crescendo. In Chicago, newspapers marveled that thousands were still flocking to Moody's meetings, even after weeks of preaching, and testimonies were pouring in. Factory workers, businessmen, mothers, they all spoke of lives changed. In London, theaters and music halls overflowed, converted into makeshift sanctuaries. Quote, Moody's meetings stir souls across denominations. The sound of Sankey's hymns carried into the streets as crowds sang along outside, unable to fit indoors. But the impact went far beyond attendance. Moody's emphasis on personal conversion and lay training multiplied the message. His Northfield Conferences were already producing new evangelists. Some went overseas as missionaries, others returned home to plant churches or launch ministries in neglected neighborhoods. Critics called it emotional religion. Supporters called it revival. The real measure was in the fruit: renewed churches, inspired missions, and a fresh sense of urgency for the gospel. And yet, Moody himself often downplayed the spectacle. Quote, It is not my sermons, but God's Spirit working through His Word. And his humility only fueled the movement further. 1885 was more than a series of meetings. It was a turning point that showed how simple preaching, heartfelt music, and persistent faith can ignite a flame felt around the world. The legacy of 1885 stretches well beyond Chicago and London. Moody's style, simple sermons, clear invitations, music that touched the heart, they became the model for evangelistic campaigns around the world. Billy Sunday, Billy Graham, countless others, they would walk that path that he first cleared. Moody's Northfield Conferences inspired a new wave of lay workers, women as well as men, who saw themselves as active participants in spreading the gospel. His interdenominational approach showed that believers could join hands across denominational lines without surrendering essential convictions. And the YMCA, which had partnered with Moody, it carried those revival methods into cities across America and abroad, blending evangelism with social action. Missions societies and Bible institutes still trace their roots to those days. The lesson is clear. Revival spreads not just through famous names, but through ordinary people trained and sent. That remains as true today as it was in 1885. Moody's story challenges us to ask some hard questions about revival. Do we mistake crowded gatherings for lives changed? Do we celebrate events without asking if hearts are truly transformed? Revival's not about numbers. It's about faithfulness. Moody preached plainly. Sankey sang earnestly. Quote, Music softens hearts for the gospel. But the real work was God stirring individuals to surrender to Jesus. And those individuals then carried the message to others. For us today, the question is simple. Are we willing to open our mouths and share Jesus with the same clarity? Are we training others to step forward when we cannot? Revival doesn't begin in a stadium. It begins in the courage of one believer to pray, to speak, and to serve. The world does not need a copy of Dwight Moody. What it needs is Christians who will do in their generation what he did in his. If this story of Dwight L. Moody's revival challenged or encouraged you, would you consider sharing this episode with a friend? You never know who might need to hear it. And while you're at it, leave a message on your podcast app. It really helps others discover Coach. Be sure to follow for weekly episodes. References and even contrary opinions are always linked in the show notes. We do that on purpose. And we've also placed some Amazon links in there to help for resources so that you can build out your library. As an Amazon associate, I do earn from qualifying purchases. You can also find Coach episodes on YouTube at the That's Jesus channel. Thanks for listening to Coach, Church Origins and Church History. I'm Bob Balch with the That's Jesus channel. Have a great day and be blessed.